The great hall of Stonehold smelled of pine resin, roasting boar, and the cloying sweetness of spilled wine. Drums beat a rhythm slow and heavy, the heartbeat of a mountain awakening. It was the sound of legacy, the sound of power changing hands. Tonight, the Halvan pack would crown its new king, for the wolves gathered in their finest furs. It was a night of celebration, of fealty sworn in the flickering torchlight. For the woman standing in the shadows of the ancient wood just beyond the gates, it was the sound of a promise about to be broken. The cold night air tasted of iron and snow, a scent she had learned to call home. The drums that celebrated a king would soon beat for a ghost. Inside the great hall, Derek Halvan felt the weight of the crown before it ever touched his head. It was an invisible pressure on his shoulders, a coldness that seeped into his bones despite the roaring hearths that threw dancing shadows against the stone walls. He sat on the Alpha's throne, a brutal thing of ironwood and wolf pelts. His father's seat, and his grandfather's before him. The air was thick with the scent of his pack. Damp wool, warm bodies, the sharp tang of their collective anticipation. They were his to protect, his to lead, his to fail. The High Elder, a stooped wolf with eyes like chips of flint, stood before him, his voice a gravelly drone as he recited the lineage of the Halvan Alphas. Names of legends and tyrants echoed in the rafters, each one a stone laid upon the foundation of Darek's future. He kept his face a mask of regal calm, his jaw set, his large hands resting on the carved wolf heads of the throne's arms. But beneath the surface, his own wolf paced, restless. The borders were weakening. The winter had been the harshest in a generation. The pack looked to him for strength, for a sign that the golden age of his father was not yet over. He had to be infallible. He had to be the king they needed. He raised a ceremonial silver goblet, the wine within the color of blood. "To the Halvan pack," he began, his voice deep and resonant, a commander's voice. "To our strength, our future, our—" He never finished the toast. The great oak doors at the far end of the hall, barred with a beam of solid iron, shuddered once, then twice. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The drummers faltered, their rhythms stumbling into a confused silence. Every head turned. The guards at the entrance drew their blades, their stances wide and uncertain. Then, with a sound like splintering bone, the iron bar cracked. The doors were thrown inward, not by a ram, but by a chilling gust of wind that smelled of snow and ash. It snaked through the hall, extinguishing half the torches in its path and plunging the celebration into a world of stark, menacing shadows. Silence. A profound, absolute silence that swallowed the whispers and the fear. Two figures stepped into the doorway first, flanking the entrance like monoliths. They were huge, larger than any wolf in the Halvan pack, clad in black leather and dark fur that seemed to drink the light. Their faces were grim, scarred, their eyes holding the flat, predatory glow of wolves who had seen too much death. They carried no banners, only heavy, dark-bladed axes that rested on their shoulders with unnerving ease. The scent that rolled off them was alien, wild, smoky, and utterly dominant. Then she walked between them. She moved with a liquid grace that was both hypnotic and terrifying. Her boots made no sound on the stone flags, yet every step commanded the attention of the entire room. She was not dressed for a coronation feast. She wore fitted black leather armor, scarred and burnished, that hugged a form leaner and harder than any Omega's. A cloak of gray wolf pelts, the color of a winter storm, fell from her shoulders. Her hair, once the color of dark honey, was now woven into a thick, severe braid laced with silver wire. But it was her crown that held every gaze. It was not gold or silver. It was forged from blackened, twisted iron, sharp and cruel, like a circlet of thorns made for a warrior, not a bride. A low murmur spread through the pack. It was a sound of disbelief, of dawning horror. Faces paled. Wolves who had once been boys and girls, now grown, took an involuntary step back. They knew that walk. They knew that silhouette, even transformed as it was by hardship and power. Derek's heart slammed against his ribs. The silver goblet slipped from his numb fingers, clattering to the stone floor and spilling its contents like a fresh wound. The scent of her hit him like a physical blow, pine needles after a frost, the clean smell of ozone before a storm, and beneath it all, the faint ghostly echo of the girl she used to be, now smothered by the overwhelming feral scent of an alpha. A true alpha. It was impossible. She was dead, exiled, broken. The weak, mute Omega he had cast aside. Reyna, he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips, unheard by anyone but the wolf inside him, which had frozen in a state of primal shock. She stopped in the center of the hall, her 2 guards fanning out behind her. Her eyes, once the color of a gentle forest floor, were now chips of glacial ice. They swept over the assembled pack, lingering for a fraction of a second on the faces she recognized. The girls who had whispered behind their hands, the boys who had jeered. There was no flicker of emotion in her gaze, no anger, no pain, only a cold, terrifying emptiness, as if she were looking at ghosts. Finally, her eyes landed on him, on the throne, on the man who had publicly shattered her world. The High Elder, recovering his composure, stepped forward, his staff held before him like a ward. "Who are you? Who dares trespass upon this sacred right?" Her lips, which he remembered as soft and perpetually curved in a shy smile, were now a thin, hard line. When she spoke, her voice was nothing like the whisper he recalled. It was low, clear, and carried the abrasive edge of honed steel. It was a voice accustomed to command. "I am the queen of the Ashfall clan," she said, and the name fell into the silence like a stone into a deep well. The Ashfall. A name from a nightmare. A clan of legend, said to have been consumed by the Great Fire in the Blighted Lands a century ago. Survivors who were more myth than wolf, rumored to be feral, godless creatures who bowed to no one. Derek rose slowly from his throne, his body moving on instinct. His alpha nature screamed at the challenge in her scent, the raw power that radiated from her in waves. But beneath the fury, a deeper, older instinct stirred, the severed phantom limb of their bond. It ached, a sharp, burning agony that lanced through his soul. He had cut it, but the roots remained, and her presence was like salt poured into the wound. "Reyna Draveth," he said, his voice a low growl that barely contained the storm inside him. "We thought you lost to the wilds." A flicker of something, mockery perhaps, danced in her cold eyes. "The wilds do not lose things, Derek. They forge them." She took a step closer, and another. The pack parted before her like a tide receding from the moon. "I have returned to offer a coronation gift to the new king." One of her guards stepped forward, unrolling a heavy stained cloth. He threw it to the floor at the foot of the dais. It was a banner. The Halvan Pack's banner, the one flown by their northernmost patrol, now ripped, burned, and stained dark with blood. A wave of fear, acrid and sharp, washed through the hall. The northern patrol had been silent for 2 weeks. They had assumed a blizzard, a simple delay. This was a message. "Your borders are weak," Reyna stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple, undeniable fact. "Your wolves are hungry. Your king is untested." Her gaze held his, and in their depths, he saw the shivering, humiliated girl in the white rejection dress, standing before this very pack. He saw the tears she never shed, the shame that had bent her back, and now he saw the iron that had replaced her spine. "I was at your borders for a month," she continued, her voice dropping, yet it seemed to fill the entire hall. "I could have bled your entire northern territory dry. I could have let the feral packs of the Frostfang Mountains pour through the gaps your men left behind. It would have been easy." "Why didn't you?" Derek forced the words out, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She gave him the ghost of a smile, a chilling, humorless expression. "Because revenge is a meal best served to a king, not a prince. I wanted you on this throne. I wanted you wearing that crown when your kingdom turns to ash." She gestured to the bloody banner on the floor. "Consider this a professional courtesy, a queen's gift to a king." The sheer audacity of her threat paralyzed the hall. This was not a plea for acceptance. This was a declaration of war. Derek descended the steps of the dais, his powerful frame radiating a furious energy. He stopped just feet from her, close enough to see the faint silver scar that traced her left eyebrow, a mark that hadn't been there before. He was taller, broader, but in that moment, she seemed to be the one who commanded the space between them. "You dare threaten my pack? In my hall? You, the broken Omega I sent away?" The words were meant to wound, to remind her of her place, of what she had been. For the first time, a genuine emotion broke through her icy facade. a raw, burning anger that made her eyes blaze. "You rejected a bride, Derek," she whispered, the words of venomous promise meant only for him. "But you created a queen. You called me unworthy of your pack. You were right. I was never meant to be the Halvan queen." She took one final, deliberate step forward, closing the distance until they were nearly touching. The phantom bond between them screamed, a siren of warning and agonizing memory. Her scent was overwhelming, a heady mix of power and the woman he had tried to forget. "I was born to be the one who brings it to its knees." The silence in the hall was a living thing, a predator that coiled around the two alphas. Reyna's words hung in the air, glittering and sharp as shards of ice. Derek felt his own wolf surge against his ribs, a beast of pure territorial fury. Every instinct screamed at him to strike, to put this impudent challenger down, to show his pack that no threat, no matter how ghost-like or familiar, could stand before their new king. He let out a low growl, a rumble that started deep in his chest and vibrated through the stone floor. It was the alpha's command, the sound that could bring 100 wolves to their knees. "You forget yourself, Omega," he snarled, deliberately using the title that was once her shame. "You stand in my hall. You breathe my air. You are nothing but a ghost playing at queens." He expected her to flinch, to show some flicker of the broken girl. She did not. Instead, a slow, cold power uncoiled from her, an aura as sharp and chilling as a winter night. It met his own dominant wave of energy, not with a crash, but with an unnerving absorption, like a black sea swallowing the light. Her two guards shifted, their hands tightening on their axes, their amber eyes fixed on him with lethal intent. "I am no one's Omega," Reyna said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. The air around her seemed to shimmer, to grow colder. "And this is not your hall. It is a tomb for a dying pack, built on a foundation of arrogance. You just haven't realized it yet." She turned her head slightly, her icy gaze sweeping over the High Elder, then to the senior wolves of the council, who were frozen in a state of horrified shock. "Tell me, elders of the great Halvan pack," she called out, her voice resonating with an authority that had been earned, not inherited. "Does your new king feel strong to you now? Does the crown sit steady on his head, while a rival queen stands unchallenged at his feet?" Her words were poison-tipped darts, aimed not at him, but at the fragile loyalty of his pack. She was undermining him, expertly, cruelly, using the very ceremony meant to solidify his power as the stage for its potential collapse. Derek's control snapped. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for her, intending to grab her, to force her to submit, to break the infuriating calm she wore like armor. But he never touched her. One of her guards moved with impossible speed, the head of his axe a dark blur as it slammed into the stone floor between them. It struck with enough force to send a spiderweb of cracks through the ancient flagstone and spray chips of rock against Derek's boots. It was a perfect, precise warning, a line drawn in stone and steel. "The queen did not give you permission to touch her," the guard growled, his voice like rocks grinding together. Reyna didn't even look at her guard. Her eyes remained locked on Derek's, a cold, triumphant fire burning in their depths. She had won this first exchange. She had walked into the heart of his power, declared war, and proven that his authority meant nothing to her or her clan. "This was my gift," she said softly, turning her back on him in the ultimate gesture of disrespect. "The next time we meet King Halvan, it will not be for a celebration." She walked away, her cloak sweeping behind her. Her guards fell into step, their heavy, silent presence a rearguard no one dared to challenge. The pack parted for them as she made her way back to the shattered doors. The great hall, once filled with the warmth of 100 bodies, felt impossibly cold in her wake. At the threshold, she paused and looked back over her shoulder, her face cast in shadow, her iron crown a jagged silhouette against the stormy night sky. "Sleep well on your new throne, Derek," she said, her voice carrying back to him on the wind. "It is the last peaceful night you will ever have." And then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness from which she came. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the crackling of the hearth and the ragged breathing of 100 stunned wolves. Then chaos erupted. Shouts and fearful whispers filled the hall. Elders clamored for answers, warriors for blood. The coronation was shattered. The celebration turned to a war council. Silence! Derek's roar shook the very rafters. He was the alpha. He was the king. And he would not let his reign begin in fear. He strode back to the dais, his face a mask of cold fury. He picked up the fallen goblet, his knuckles white around the stem. The feast is over. My council will meet me in the war room in 1 hour. The rest of you go to your homes, bar your doors, double the watch on the walls. Now. His command brooked no argument. The pack, desperate for leadership, for a show of strength after the humiliation they had just witnessed, obeyed. They filed out of the hall, their faces grim, the earlier festive mood a distant, bitter memory. Alone with his council of 5, the mask began to crack. He slumped onto his throne, the weight of the crown he had not yet received feeling heavier than a mountain. The High Elder Vorlog approached him, his ancient face etched with worry. "My king," Vorlog began, his voice raspy. "The Ashfall clan. They are a myth, a children's story to scare pups." "That was no myth," grunted Kalen, his beta and master of arms, a thick-necked wolf with a roadmap of scars on his face. He gestured to the cracked flagstone. "That was steel and muscle. And that scent? I've never smelled an alpha like her. It was old and cold." Derek ran a hand over his face. The phantom ache of the severed bond was a raging fire in his chest. When she had stood so close, it had been a physical agony, a tearing sensation in his very soul. He had hidden it, buried it under a mountain of rage, but now, in the relative quiet, the pain was blinding. "She was an Omega," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Mute, weak. Her wolf spirit was so faint, it was barely a whisper. He remembered the day of their pairing ceremony, 5 years ago. Rhaena Draveth, chosen for him by the elders for the purity of her Omega bloodline, a line said to produce strong heirs. She had stood before him, small and trembling in a white dress, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. He had felt the bond snap into place between them, a fragile, shimmering thread, and he had felt nothing, no spark of strength, no resonance of power. She was a placid pool when he needed a raging river to match his own. His father was dying. Their rivals in the east were testing their borders. The pack needed a strong Luna, an alpha mate who could anchor his power, rule by his side with an iron will. Rhaena, with her downcast eyes and her refusal to speak, was not that wolf. She was a liability, a weakness his enemies would exploit. So he had done the unthinkable. In front of the entire pack, with the bond still fresh and raw between them, he had rejected her. He had snapped the cord, a spiritual violence that had left her reeling and him emptier than he could ever have imagined. He had told himself it was necessary. A king's duty is to his pack, not his heart. He had exiled her, sending her into the wilds with a day's worth of supplies. A cruel but necessary act to show his pack that he would not tolerate weakness, not even in his own mate. He had expected her to die. He had, in some dark part of his soul, prayed for it, for a quick end to the ghost that haunted him. He had never imagined she would return like this, forged into the very thing he had accused her of not being. "Find out everything you can about the Ashfall clan," Derek ordered his council, his voice hard. "Where they are camped, how many they number, what their strengths are. Send scouts, but tell them to be shadows. I want to know how a forgotten Omega became a queen of ghosts." The council dispersed, leaving Derek alone in the vast, silent hall. The torches guttered, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping fingers. He walked to the spot where Rhaena had stood, where her guard's axe had scarred his floor. He crouched, tracing the cracks with his fingertips. The stone was cold, but he could almost feel the residual energy of her challenge, the chilling echo of her power. He had created this. Her hatred, her strength, her crown of iron, they were all forged in the fire of his rejection. He had wanted a queen of iron, and the fates, in their cruel, mocking wisdom, had given him one. But she was not his queen. She was his enemy, his undoing. The ache in his chest intensified, and he pressed his fist against his sternum. The bond was not truly gone. A severed limb can still feel pain. He could feel her, a distant, cold star in the darkness of his soul. Her rage was a quiet hum, her pain a sharp sting, her resolve a wall of ice. She was out there, in the darkness beyond his walls, and she was coming for him. Not just for his throne, but for his heart, his soul, for the part of him that he had cut away and thrown into the wilderness 5 years ago. The king who rejected her now bleeds, a line from the old tales whispered in his mind. And Derek Halvin, alone on his scarred floor, in his silent hall, finally understood the true meaning of a crown forged in regret. The Ashfall camp was a place of disciplined silence. It lay hidden in a narrow, black stone canyon, miles north of Stonehold, a place the Halvin scouts would never think to look, believing it to be haunted by the spirits of a long-dead tribe. There were no roaring bonfires, only small, contained pits that gave off more heat than smoke. The scent was of charred meat, wet pine, and the clean metallic smell of sharpened steel. The wolves of the Ashfall clan moved with a quiet purpose, their faces grim and unreadable, their loyalty to the woman in the central tent absolute. Reyna sat on a simple stool made of dark wood, a whetstone in one hand, a long, cruelly curved dagger in the other. The blade was dark, forged from meteor iron, and it drank the dim light from the tallow lamp, schlick, schlick. The sound was rhythmic, meditative, the only sound in her tent besides the whisper of the wind against the thick hide walls. She wore simple black breeches and a linen tunic, her armor set aside. On her forearm, a network of fine silvery scars caught the light, a permanent reminder of the trials that had forged her. The exhilaration of her performance in Derek's hall had faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. It was not triumph she felt, but the grim satisfaction of a plan set in motion. She had planted the seed of fear, now she would watch it grow. One of her guards, Boron, the one who had cracked Derek's floor, entered her tent, his massive frame stooping to clear the entrance. He carried a wooden bowl of steaming broth and a piece of roasted meat. He placed it silently on the small table beside her. "The scouts have returned, my queen," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The Halvin pack is sealed inside its walls. Their patrols have doubled, but they are clumsy, frightened. They move like prey, not predators." Reyna nodded, not looking up from her blade. "Let them. Fear makes a wolf sloppy. It dulls the senses." Boron hesitated, a rare sign of uncertainty from the stoic warrior. "To see you stand before him. It was a good day, Reyna." He used her name, a privilege afforded to only him and his brother, Fane. They had found her half dead in a snowdrift 5 years ago, a slip of a girl with frozen tears on her cheeks and a fire in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. They had taken her to their clan, a broken remnant of survivors, and had watched as she rose, not through birthright, but through sheer, unbreakable will. She had learned their ways, mastered their weapons, and earned their allegiance by being stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than any alpha they had ever known. "It was a necessary day," she corrected him, her voice flat. She set the dagger aside and picked up the bowl, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. The broth smelled of herbs and scorched bone. It was the taste of survival, so different from the wine and spiced meats of the life she'd almost had. As she ate, she allowed herself a moment to feel it, the phantom limb of the bond. It had throbbed with a dull, persistent ache for 5 years, a constant reminder of her humiliation. But since seeing him, the ache had sharpened. It was a live wire humming with his energy. She could feel the chaotic storm of his emotions, the volcanic rage, the bitter sting of wounded pride, and beneath it all, a tremor of something she hadn't expected. Fear, not for his life, but for his pack. For his crown, she welcomed his rage. It was a clean, honest fire. It was the fear that she savored, a cold, sweet poison. She would nurture that fear, let it seep into the cracks of his kingdom until the entire structure came crashing down. She finished her meal and stood, her movements fluid and economical. "Tell the hunting parties to push their range west. Take the deer and elk from the Halvin's winter stores. Let them see our tracks. Let them know we are everywhere. But no one is to engage. We are ghosts, and ghosts do not bleed." Boron bowed his head. "As you command." He left her alone with the sound of the whetstone and the whispering wind. In the war room of Stonehold, the air was thick with the scent of stale fear. Maps were spread across a massive oak table, weighted down with ceremonial daggers. Derek stood over them, his fists planted on the wood, his knuckles white. For 2 days, his scouts had returned with nothing but panicked whispers. They found tracks that vanished into thin air. They felt eyes on their backs from trees that held only shadows. One patrol had found their entire winter meat store, a cave full of cured carcasses, completely empty, the only thing left behind a single gray wolf hair resting on a blood-stained hook. "This is impossible," Kalen, his beta, slammed a fist on the table, making the daggers jump. "They are wolves, not spirits. They have a camp. They have to sleep, eat shit. Why can't we find them?" "Because they do not want to be found," Elder Vorlog countered, his voice a dry rasp. "They are of the wild, Kalen. They think like the wild. We have grown soft in these stone walls. We have forgotten the old ways." "So we do nothing?" Kalen roared. "We sit here and wait for this Omega Queen to starve us out?" "I did not say do nothing," Vorlog said, his flinty eyes on Derek. "I said we must be smarter. An open attack is what she expects. It is a trap." Derek said nothing. He was listening to the echoes in his own blood. He could feel Reyna, not her location, but her presence. It was a cold pressure against the northern edge of his senses, a constant, chilling reminder that she was out there, watching. The bond, which he had once seen as a source of potential strength, had become an instrument of his own torture. Her calm was a blade against his fraying nerves. Her resolve was a weight on his soul. Just then, the doors to the war room burst open. 2 guards stumbled in, supporting a third man between them. It was Lyron, one of his best scouts. His face was pale as death. His leathers were torn, and a crude, hastily wrapped bandage on his thigh was soaked through with blood. "My king!" Lyron gasped, his eyes wide with fever and terror. Derek was at his side in an instant, helping to lower him into a chair. "What happened? Report." "The Whisperwood, west of the river," Lyron panted, his breath catching in a painful shudder. "We thought we found a trail. It was too easy. We walked right into it." He shook his head, a haunted look in his eyes. "There was no sound, my king. No warning. One moment we were moving through the trees. The next, Torin was gone. Just a gurgle and the scent of blood. Then Marius, an arrow in his throat. They were in the trees, in the snow, everywhere and nowhere." "How many were there?" Kalen demanded, leaning over the wounded scout. "I don't know," Lyron whispered, his voice breaking. "I never saw more than a shadow, a flash of a dark blade. They move like smoke. They don't howl. They don't shout. They just kill." He gripped Derek's arm, his fingers surprisingly strong. "They let me go, the one who cut me." He was huge, scarred face. He leaned down and whispered in my ear. Derek's blood ran cold. "What did he say?" Lyron's eyes met his, and in them Derek saw the absolute victory of Reyna's psychological war. He said, "The Queen sends her regards. The price for a broken promise is paid in blood. Your king's is next." The room was utterly still. Kalen's face was a mask of murderous rage. Vorlog's was grim, the lines around his mouth deepening. Derek felt a cold fury rise within him, so potent it was almost dizzying. This was her message, not just a threat, but proof. Proof that she could touch him, bleed him, whenever she pleased. He dismissed the council, ordering the healers to tend to Lyron. He needed to be alone. He walked from the oppressive confines of the war room to a high balcony that overlooked the vast, snow-dusted expanse of his kingdom. The wind was sharp, biting at his exposed skin, but he barely felt it. His entire being was focused inward, on the agonizing humming wire that connected him to Reyna. He had severed it once with brute force. He had ignored its phantom pains for years. Now he reached for it. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world, and poured all of his frustration, his rage, his fear for his pack, into that connection. He didn't send words. He sent a wave of raw primal emotion, an alpha's roar translated into pure spiritual force. Why are you doing this to your own people?" In her tent, Reyna gasped. The dagger clattered from her hands. The force of his emotions slammed into her, an invisible fist to the gut. It was a deluge of fury, desperation, and a surprising, gut-wrenching torrent of regret. For a moment, she was overwhelmed, her carefully constructed walls of ice threatening to crack. The sheer power of his alpha spirit, something she had never truly felt before, was a physical thing, a crushing weight. She gritted her teeth, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. No, she would not be his victim again. He wanted to communicate. He wanted to know why. She would show him. She pushed back. She didn't send her own rage. That was a weapon he would understand, one he could fight. Instead, she reached deep inside herself, past the scars and the iron, to the memory she had buried under years of pain and training. She focused on it, polished it like a lens, and then she hurled it back down the bond with all her strength. On the balcony, Derek cried out, stumbling back against the cold stone railing. It hit him not as a thought, but as a full sensory experience. He was no longer on his balcony. He was standing on the ceremonial dais, 5 years younger. He felt the scratchy wool of his formal tunic, smelled the cloying incense of the bonding rite, and he was looking through her eyes. He saw himself, a younger, more arrogant Derek. His face a mask of cold disdain. He felt the floor tremble beneath small, slippered feet. He felt the frantic, hopeful, terrified beating of her heart. He heard the whispers of the crowd. So small. The quiet one. He'll break her. And felt the sting of shame as if the words were his own. Then he heard his own voice, cold and cruel, echoing in the hall. I reject this union. This Omega is not fit to be my Luna. She is weak and worthy. I sever this bond. He felt the bond snap, a tearing, searing agony that ripped through her soul, a pain 1,000 times worse than what he had felt. He felt her breath leave her body, her world tilting into a vortex of shock and humiliation. He felt the cold draft as the doors were open, the sting of the first snowflake on her cheek as she was cast out. He felt the crushing weight of utter desolation, the feeling of being completely and utterly alone, discarded by her mate, her pack, her world. The vision shattered. Derek was on his knees, gasping for air, his hand clutching his chest, as if he could physically hold his heart together. The pain was real, a ghost of her agony branded onto his soul. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and the winter wind felt like fire on his skin. He had known what he did was cruel. He had told himself it was necessary, but he had never, not for a moment, understood the true depth of the wound he had inflicted. Now he did. She had made him feel it. This wasn't a war for land or resources. This was a reckoning. She wasn't trying to break his kingdom. She was dismantling his soul, piece by agonizing piece, using the echoes of their own broken bond as her weapon. The backlash of her own attack left Raina trembling. She stood rigid in the center of her tent, her hands braced on the table, the wood grain digging into her palms, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, reaching into that well of memory, weaponizing her own deepest trauma, had come at a cost. The ice around her soul had cracked, and for a terrifying moment, the flood of 5-year-old agony was as fresh as if the rejection had happened an hour ago. She felt the shame burn on her cheeks, the hollow despair that had nearly consumed her in the snow. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the images away, rebuilding her walls brick by painful brick. Control. That was her armor. Emotion was a weakness Derek had exploited once. She would not allow it to happen again. When she felt the psychic recoil from him, the wave of his shocked, horrified guilt, it was a bitter balm. Good, let him choke on it. Baran entered without a sound, his presence a solid, grounding weight in the swaying tent. He saw her posture, the unnatural stillness, the white-knuckled grip on the table. Raina? He asked, his voice a low thrum of concern. You are pale. She straightened slowly, forcing a breath into her tight lungs. I am fine, her voice was steady, betraying none of the internal chaos. The king and I were communicating. Baran's scarred face darkened. He knew of the phantom bond. She had been forced to explain the debilitating pains that sometimes struck her in the early years. He did not understand its nuances, but he understood it as a wound, a vulnerability. He hurt you. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that carried a promise of bloody retribution. He reminded me why we are here, she corrected, turning to face him. The tremor was gone. Her eyes once again chips of glacial ice. The fear I felt in him. It was a start, but it is not enough. She would not be satisfied until his guilt curdled into despair, until the crown on his head felt like a brand of shame. Derek pushed himself up from the cold stone of the balcony. His legs were unsteady, his body slick with a cold sweat. Her pain was a residue in his mind, a phantom taste of ash and salt. He had thought his rejection was a clean cut, a surgical necessity for the good of the pack. He saw now that it had been a clumsy, brutal amputation, and he was only just beginning to feel the gangrene. He stalked back to the war room, his stride long and furious. Kaelin and Vorlog were still there, locked in a silent battle of wills over the maps. They looked up as he entered, their expressions hardening when they saw the look on his face. "We attack," Kaelin said immediately, seeing the storm in his alpha's eyes. "A full-scale sweep of the northern canyons. We burn them out, root and stem." "No," Derek said, his voice raw. The word was so final, so absolute, that Kaelin took a step back in shock. "My king, they are bleeding us dry. They mock us." "And a blind charge into the dark is exactly what she wants," Derek countered, his gaze sweeping over the map, but not truly seeing it. He was seeing her face in his mind, superimposed over the terrain. "She is goading us into a rash decision. She wants our warriors broken in her traps, our pride shattered by a futile assault. We will not give her the satisfaction." Vorlog stroked his thin gray beard, his ancient eyes watchful. "Then what do you propose, my king? You have felt her power. This is more than a territorial dispute. This is a war of the spirit." Derek stopped pacing and looked at the elder. "You are right. And you cannot win a war of the spirit with axes and arrows." He had felt her soul. He had tasted her agony. He had to face her, not as a king facing a rival, but as the man who had created this ghost. "I am going to meet with her," he announced. The statement dropped into the room like a chunk of granite. Kaelin stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Meet with her? Derek, she will kill you. She'll put your head on a spike and display it for your pack to see." "She could have killed my scout and sent his head back. She didn't. She sent a message," Derek reasoned, his mind racing. "Everything she has done has been calculated. Psychological. She wants to dismantle me, not just kill me. A dead king cannot suffer." He looked at Kaelin, his eyes blazing with a desperate certainty. "I have to face her, alone." "This is madness," Kaelin snarled. "It is the only way," Vorlog said quietly, a flicker of understanding in his gaze. "A wound of the bond must be treated at the source. But where would such a meeting take place? Her ghost will not allow you near their camp, and she would never set foot in Stonehold again." Derek closed his eyes, focusing once more on the thin, humming wire that connected him to Reyna. There was one place, a place of power, a place that belonged to neither of them, and yet to both of them. A place where vows were made and destinies sealed, nestled in a silent, ancient grove of white-barked aspens. "The Moonstone Altar," he whispered. He didn't need to send scouts or messengers. He would send the invitation himself. He focused his will, gathering not his anger, but a clear, singular image. The great flat slab of pale, glowing rock under the full moon, surrounded by the silent, watching trees. He pushed the image down the bond, a silent, desperate plea for parley. He attached no emotion to it, no threat, no demand, only the image, and a single unspoken word. "Tonight." Reyna felt the summons as a cool, clear image blooming behind her eyes. The Moonstone Altar. Her breath caught in her throat. Of all the places. It was where generations of Halvan Alphas had taken their mates to whisper their true vows, under the eyes of the moon goddess, away from the pack. It was where the Alpha bond was said to be truly forged, in silence and starlight. She and Derek were to have gone there the night of their bonding ceremony. It was the part of the ritual she had secretly dreamed of, a moment of quiet connection away from the prying eyes and political pressures. It was a promise that had died with all the others. "It is a trap," Boren growled from beside her. He had felt her sudden stillness, seen the flicker of shock in her eyes. "He means to ambush you." "Perhaps," she murmured, her gaze distant. But she didn't believe it. An ambush was Kaelin's way. It was clumsy. Derek, for all his arrogance, was more cunning than that. And this felt different. This was personal. He was choosing a battlefield of memory, not of swords. "I will not permit you to go," Boren stated, his protective instincts overriding his deference. Reyna turned her full attention to him, her gaze sharp enough to cut. "You will not permit me? Boren, you are my most trusted friend and my strongest shield. But you forget who I am. I am your queen. I make the decisions, and I am going." His jaw tightened, but he bowed his head in submission. "Then we will go with you, Fane and I. We will watch from the trees. At the first sign of treachery, we will cut him down." She considered this. It was a wise precaution. "Agreed, but you will remain hidden unless I call for you. This is between him and me." She would go not because she trusted him, but because she had to. To refuse was to show fear. To refuse was to admit that the ghost of the girl who had dreamed of that altar still had power over her. She would go and stand on that sacred stone, not as a hopeful bride, but as a queen of ashes, and she would show him that his chosen battlefield held no power over her anymore. The moonstone altar glowed with a soft internal luminescence under the cold, clear moon. The air was still and freezing, each breath a cloud of white vapor. Derek stood alone beside the stone, stripped of his ceremonial furs, wearing only simple black leathers. He carried no sword. He had come as he was, a wolf, a man, a king burdened by his own sins. He felt her approach long before he saw her. A subtle shift in the night, a sharpening of the scents of pine and snow. She emerged from the shadows of the aspens, a specter in black armor. Her iron crown a jagged shadow on her brow. Boren and Fane melted back into the darkness, their predatory presence a palpable weight on the edge of the clearing. She stopped on the opposite side of the altar, the pale stone separating them like a river. Her face was a beautiful, terrifying mask of cold control. He had rehearsed 100 things to say, but in her presence they all felt like foolish lies. He settled on the only truth that mattered. "I felt it," he said, his voice hoarse in the profound silence. "When you sent it, the rejection. I felt what I did to you." Her lips curled in a humorless smile. "You felt an echo, Derek. An echo in a comfortable king who has never known a day of real hunger or fear. You cannot possibly comprehend the reality." "Then make me comprehend," he said, taking a half step closer. "What do you want, Reyna? Is it land, gold, a title? Name your price for the Northern Territories. Name your price for peace." He was falling back on the familiar, the language of kings and treaties, a desperate attempt to frame this as a problem he could solve. Her laugh was a brittle, shocking sound in the sacred grove. "Price? You think this is about a price?" She leaned forward, her armored hands resting on the cold altar stone. Her eyes glittered with a chilling fire. "I want you to feel what it is to have everything you have ever known. Everything you were born to protect, turn to ash in your hands. I want you to look at the faces of your pack, the mothers, the children, the elders, and know that you are the architect of their ruin. I want the silence in your great hall to be the silence of a graveyard. That is my price." Her words struck him harder than any physical blow. This was the depth of her wound, the scope of her vengeance. It was absolute. She wanted to annihilate his world as he had annihilated hers. He stared at her, at the unwavering resolve in her eyes, and a profound, aching sadness washed over him, momentarily drowning the guilt and the fear. He saw the beautiful, quiet girl she had been, hidden deep beneath the layers of iron and ice. "Was there ever a time, Reyna," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "even for a moment, after the bond snapped into place, when it wasn't a curse to you?" The question blindsided her. It was not a king's question. It was personal, intimate, a direct strike at the heart of the girl she had buried. For the first time, a crack appeared in her composure. A flicker of unbearable pain crossed her features, so fast it was almost imagined. Her throat worked, but no sound came out. The queen had no answer for that. He saw it. He saw the ghost of the girl who had hoped. Driven by an instinct older and deeper than rank or rage, he reached across the altar. He didn't try to grab her, to command her. His movements were slow, deliberate. He reached for her hand, his fingers barely brushing the cold, scarred leather of her gauntlet. The moment his skin touched the material covering hers, a jolt, white-hot and electric, shot up both their arms. The bond, the ghost between them, flared into brilliant, agonizing life. It was not the searing pain of the severing, nor the dull ache of its absence. It was a fire of pure connection, of recognition, of what was, what could have been, and what was now so terribly broken. Reyna gasped, snatching her hand back as if burned, her eyes wide with shock and something else, something he hadn't seen since she was a girl. Fear. The jolt of the bond's awakening was a physical violation. It ripped through Reyna's defenses, a lightning strike that left every nerve ending screaming. For 5 years, the connection had been a phantom limb, a dull ache she had learned to live with, to ignore. But his touch, even through her glove, had sent a surge of raw, undiluted life down that deadened nerve. It was a current of pure alpha power, of his scent, his soul, his undeniable presence, flooding the empty spaces inside her. She stumbled back from the altar, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The queen of the Ashfall, who had faced down feral beast and survived the blighted lands, was undone by a simple touch. She looked at her gloved hand, then at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and terror. The control she had spent years forging was shattering like thin ice under a hammer blow. Derek was just as stunned. He stared at his own hand, his fingers tingling with the aftershock. He had felt it too, not just a spark, but a torrent. He had felt her. Beneath the ice and iron, he had felt the shivering, resilient core of the woman she was. He'd felt her shock, her fear, and beneath that, a deep, resonant hum of recognition that his wolf answered with a possessive, instinctive growl deep in his chest. The bond was not dead. It had been sleeping, and he had just shaken it awake. "What was that?" she whispered, the words torn from her throat. Her voice was no longer the cold, commanding tone of a queen, but the breathless sound of the girl he remembered. "It's still there," he said, his own voice rough with disbelief. "Reyna, it's not gone." He took a step around the altar, moving into her space. The air crackled between them, thick with a tension that was no longer just about hatred and revenge. It was older, more primal. Her scent filled his senses, pine and storm and ash, and his wolf, the beast he had kept chained by duty and guilt, stirred with a powerful, forgotten hunger. She flinched back, raising a hand as if to ward him off. "Don't." The word was a plea, a command, and a confession of her own vulnerability all at once. From the trees a low growl rumbled, a clear warning. Boren and Fane were watching, tense to strike. Derek ignored them. His entire world had narrowed to the woman before him, to the impossible, agonizing truth that the connection he had tried to destroy had endured. It had survived his cruelty, her exile, her hatred. It was scarred and twisted, but it was alive. "All this time," he said, his voice laced with a dawning horror and a flicker of something else, a wild, impossible hope. "All this pain you've carried. You've felt me, haven't you? Every time the pack was in danger, every time my father's illness grew worse. You felt it." Reyna's jaw tightened. She couldn't deny it. The sudden, inexplicable bouts of anxiety, the phantom aches that mirrored wounds he'd taken in border skirmishes, the profound wave of grief that had nearly brought her to her knees a year ago, the day his father, the old Alpha, had died. She had told herself it was a curse, an echo. She had refused to acknowledge what it truly was, a two-way street. "It doesn't change anything," she bit out, regaining a sliver of her composure. She was the queen. She was vengeance. This was a trick, a weakness he was trying to exploit. "The pain I felt was mine. The pain I will bring to you will be yours." "Will it?" he challenged, his voice dropping, becoming dangerously soft. "Can you truly separate the two, Reyna? When you bleed my pack, when you starve my people, will you not feel the wound yourself through this?" He gestured to the space between them, to the living, breathing connection that hummed in the air. "You felt my guilt a moment ago. I know you did. What will you feel when you force me to watch my kingdom die? Will you savor my agony, or will you drown in it with me?" His words were a poisoned arrow, finding the one chink in her iron armor. She had planned her revenge with the cold precision of a master strategist, but she had never accounted for this. She had never imagined that to destroy him, she might also have to destroy a part of herself she thought long dead. Her silence was his answer. He saw the conflict warring in her eyes, the queen's cold fury against the woman's sudden, terrifying uncertainty. He pressed his advantage, driven by a desperate need to pull her back from the abyss she was leading them both towards. "This path you are on," he continued, his voice resonating with the Alpha's command but softened with a plea. "It will break you as surely as it breaks me. Look at what you've become. A queen of ghosts, ruling from the shadows, fueled by a pain that is 5 years old. Is this truly all you are now? Is there nothing left of the girl who who dreamed of this place. "That girl is dead," she snarled, the words a raw, visceral cry of denial. "You killed her. You stood before our people and you slit her throat with your words. You buried her in the snow." "Did I?" He stepped closer still, so close he could see the faint pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. The scent of her was intoxicating, a maddening blend of the familiar and the dangerously new. "Or did I just force her to become a wolf? A true wolf, stronger than any I have ever known. Stronger than me." The admission hung between them, stunning them both. He had said it, the truth he had been trying to deny since she walked back into his hall. Her strength, forged in the fires of his rejection, now outstripped his own. He was a king by birthright. She was a queen by survival. The raw honesty of his words did what his anger and commands could not. It disarmed her. Her rigid posture softened, the fury in her eyes replaced by a deep, aching confusion. She stared at him, truly seeing him, perhaps for the first time. Not as the arrogant prince, not as the cruel alpha, but as a man trapped by his own legacy, confessing his own inadequacy. The phantom bond between them shifted. The agonizing thrum softened into a deep, resonant pulse, a rhythm that was starting to feel less like a curse and more like a heartbeat. Her wolf, a creature she had trained to be a silent, cold weapon, stirred within her. It did not see a rival alpha to be defeated. It saw its mate, battered, foolish, broken, but its mate. She felt a dizzying pull toward him, an instinct so powerful it threatened to sweep her away. It was the bond, awakened and hungry, demanding to be healed. It wanted her to close the final few feet between them, to place her hand on his chest, to feel the steady beat of his heart. It wanted her to surrender. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She took a staggering step back, shaking her head. Vengeance. That was her purpose. That was what had kept her alive. To abandon it now, what would be left of her? She would be that broken girl again, lost and without a purpose. "Raina," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He reached for her again, slowly, his hand open, his expression stripped of all its regal pride, showing only a raw, desperate man. She couldn't let him touch her. If he did, she knew she would be lost. She turned and fled. She moved with the fluid speed of a shadow, melting back into the aspen grove before he could react. He heard Boren and Fane moving with her, their presence fading into the night. Derek was left alone at the altar, his hands still outstretched. The clearing felt profoundly empty, the silence now a ringing accusation. He had come here for a parley, a negotiation. He had found something far more dangerous. He had found the ghost of a bond, and in trying to fight it, he had accidentally breathed life back into its lungs. He had not won a reprieve for his pack. He had only complicated the war. He had wanted to break her resolve, but he had only succeeded in cracking his own. Because now, as he stood under the cold, indifferent moon, he had to face the most terrifying truth of all. He had rejected her because he thought she was weak. But as he felt the lingering echo of her strength, her pain, her incredible resilience pulsing through their connection, he knew he had been a fool. And as he remembered the look of raw vulnerability in her eyes before she fled, he understood that he didn't just want to save his kingdom from her. He wanted to save her from himself. And he had no idea how. Raina ran. She didn't stop until the glow of the moonstone altar was a forgotten memory, and the oppressive darkness of the canyon embraced her. She burst into her camp, a whirlwind of black leather and suppressed panic, sweeping past her startled guards and into the solitude of her tent. Boran and Fane followed, their heavy footsteps halting at the entrance, their concern a palpable presence. "Leave me," she commanded, her back to them, her voice a strained chord about to snap. They hesitated, a low murmur of protest passing between them, but the sheer force of her will pushed them away. The tent flap fell, plunging her into near darkness, save for the dying embers in her brazier. She tore off her gauntlets, her fingers fumbling with the buckles. Her hands were shaking. She stared at them in the dim red light, strong hands, calloused and scarred from years of wielding a blade, now trembling like a frightened doe. She had faced down Derek in his own throne room, stared into the eyes of death in the wilds, and commanded the loyalty of wolves who had forgotten the meaning of the word. Yet a single touch, a single moment of shared vulnerability had ripped her world from its axis. Her wolf, the silent partner in her vengeance, was in turmoil. It paced the cage of her ribs, whining, confused. For 5 years it had been honed into an instrument of her will, its grief and longing suppressed, its energy channeled into cold, hard survival. Now the bond, awakened and vibrant, was singing to it. It was a siren's call, a promise of wholeness, of belonging, of the one thing her power and her crown could never give her, a mate. "Be silent," she whispered to the beast within, pressing a fist to her chest, but it would not be silenced. It clawed at the inside of her soul, desperate to answer the call, to turn back toward the alpha who was its other half. Her meticulously constructed identity was crumbling. She was the queen of the Ashfall. She was vengeance incarnate. Her purpose was to see Derek's kingdom fall. But his words, his confession of her strength, his raw, unguarded plea at the altar, they had planted a seed of doubt. What will you feel when you force me to watch my kingdom die? Will you savor my agony? Or will you drown in it with me? She sank onto her stool, her head in her hands. He was right. The thought of bringing ruin to the innocent pups, the elders who had once smiled at her, the pack that was, by blood, her own people. It now sent a sickening wave of anticipatory grief through her. The bond would make her feel every bit of their pain, channeled through him. Her perfect revenge was a double-edged sword, and she was beginning to realize that the blade pointed at her own heart was just as sharp. A cold dread, colder than any winter snow, seeped into her bones. She was trapped. To continue on her path was to condemn herself to a living hell of shared agony. To turn back was to surrender, to admit defeat, to become nothing. The broken Omega, crawling back to the Alpha who had cast her out. The thought was so vile, so humiliating, it made her physically ill. There was no victory for her. There was only a choice of poisons. Derek returned to Stonehold as the first pale light of dawn touched the sky. He did not go to the war room or his council. He went to the Royal Archives, a dusty, forgotten chamber beneath the Great Hall, filled with the crumbling scrolls and leather-bound histories of his ancestors. He lit a lantern, the flickering light casting monstrous shadows on the walls, and he began to search. His mind was a maelstrom. The feel of the bond, vibrantly alive, was a constant thrum beneath his skin. It changed everything. His war was not with a rival queen, it was with the other half of his own soul. He could not destroy her without destroying himself. He could not win by force. He searched for hours, his hands covered in dust, sifting through ancient lore on pack bonds, mating rites, and the forgotten histories of the first alphas. Most of it was useless, romantic poetry and rigid legal doctrine. But then, tucked away in a brittle iron-bound tome, he found it. A chapter titled The Alpha's Echo, on Severed Bonds and Soul Scars. He read with a frantic intensity, his heart pounding. The ancient text spoke of the Alpha bond not as a simple connection, but as a living entity. It could be wounded, even seemingly killed, but its root, once planted in two souls, could never be truly destroyed. The text described a rare, forbidden right, the right of reclamation. It was a dangerous gamble, an all-or-nothing ritual that could either heal a shattered bond, making it stronger than it had ever been, or utterly annihilate it, destroying the wolf spirit of both participants in the process. It required one alpha to completely and utterly surrender their power to the other, to kneel, to submit, to offer their throat in a gesture of absolute trust. It was a relinquishing of ego, of pride, of the very essence of what it meant to be an alpha. For the bond to be reborn, one of them had to be willing to be broken first. He slumped back against the shelves, the heavy book in his lap. Surrender for an alpha? It was a fate worse than death. It was unthinkable. His pack would see it as the ultimate act of weakness. His enemies would pounce. Kaelin would likely challenge him for leadership on the spot. But as he thought of Reyna, of the torment in her eyes, of the path of self-destruction she was on, he knew it was the only way. He had broken her with his pride. Perhaps he could only heal her, heal them, with his humility. It was a mad, desperate gamble, one that could cost him everything, his crown, his pack, his life. But the alternative, a slow, agonizing war that would bleed them both dry, was no longer a choice he could accept. He had made his decision. He sent a single rider, a trusted guard, with a simple, unsealed message. It was not a challenge or a threat. It was an offering. The western plains at sunrise tomorrow, where the river bends. Come alone. I will do the same. It ends now. When Reyna received the message, she crushed the parchment in her fist. The western plains. An open, neutral ground. No trees for an ambush, no sacred stones for emotional manipulation. Just a flat, empty expanse where two wolves would meet their fate. He is luring you into the open, Baran insisted, his hand on the hilt of his axe. It's a trap. Let us go. We will end this, my queen. We will bring you his head. No, Reyna's voice was eerily calm. The storm inside her had passed, leaving behind a cold, desolate clarity. She had spent the night wrestling with her own soul and had emerged with a terrible, resolute purpose. Derek had offered her a choice between two poisons. She would choose a third option. This is my battle, mine alone. She would meet him, she would face him one last time. But she would not go to surrender nor to negotiate. The bond was a weakness, a cancer in her soul. He had tried to cut it out and failed. Now she would finish the job. She would pour every ounce of her hatred, her pain, and her power into that connection, and she would shatter it for good, even if it meant destroying her own wolf spirit in the process. Better to be a human with a crown than a wolf in a cage of her own making. The sunrise bled across the horizon in hues of rose and violet, painting the frost-covered plains in ethereal light. They faced each other from 50 paces, two solitary figures in a vast, empty world. The morning air was sharp and still. Reyna wore her black armor and her iron crown, a warrior queen ready for her final battle. Derek wore simple leathers, no crown, no weapon. He looked not like a king, but like a penitent. As she walked toward him, she began to gather her power. She pulled on the threads of her anger, her humiliation, her grief. She focused it all into a single point, a spiritual spear aimed at the bond that pulsed between them. She would let him get close, and then she would strike, ending it forever. He walked to meet her, his steps steady, his eyes fixed on hers. He could feel the lethal energy building in her, a storm of dark power that made the air itself tremble. He could see the resolve in her eyes, the decision to choose oblivion over surrender, and he knew he had only one chance. When they were 10 feet apart, he stopped, and he knelt. He went down on one knee in the frosted grass, his head bowed. He lowered himself until both knees were on the ground, his body open, vulnerable. Then he tilted his head back, exposing the pale, unprotected line of his throat. The gesture was so shocking, so utterly contrary to the laws of their world, that it stopped Reyna in her tracks. The spear of energy she was building faltered. He was submitting. The king of the Halvan pack, the proud alpha who had called her unworthy, was kneeling before her. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "A trick? A mockery?" "It is the end," he said, his voice quiet. Yet it carried across the plains. His eyes, fixed on hers, held no deceit, no strategy, only a profound, heartbreaking sincerity. "You want your vengeance? Take it. You want my kingdom? It's yours. You want me to feel the pain of utter defeat? I feel it now. You have won, Reyna." Her mind reeled. This was not how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to fight him, to break him, to force him to his knees. For him to do it willingly, it stole all the power from her victory, leaving it hollow and meaningless. "Get up," she ordered, her voice shaking with a rage born of confusion. "No," he said softly. "You told me I created a queen. You were right, and a king must know when to kneel to a power greater than his own." He took a slow, deep breath. "I broke you with my pride, so I offer you my throat. End it. Destroy the bond, destroy me, take your revenge, but let the pack live. Their only crime was following an arrogant fool of an alpha. Punish me, not them." He closed his eyes, surrendering completely to her mercy or her wrath. Reyna stood frozen, her heart a war drum in her chest. Everything she had ever wanted was right in front of her. His life, his submission, the ultimate vengeance. All she had to do was unleash the power she had gathered, and it would all be over, but she couldn't. Looking at him kneeling in the dirt, his life willingly offered to her, she did not see a king. She saw the foolish, burdened man who had confessed his own weakness at the altar. She saw the other half of her own wounded soul. To destroy him now would not be an act of vengeance. It would be an execution, an act of cruelty that would make her no better than he had been. The bond between them pulsed, no longer a painful shackle, but a quiet, powerful current, flowing from his open, surrendered heart to her own. It carried his regret, his shame, his desperate hope for redemption. With a cry that was half sob, half roar, she let the dark energy she had gathered dissipate, releasing it harmlessly into the morning sky. The iron crown felt impossibly heavy on her head. She reached up with a trembling hand and pulled it off, letting it fall to the frosted ground. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing over him. He did not flinch, did not open his eyes. He waited for the blow to fall. Instead, she knelt in front of him, face to face, equals in the dust, and she reached out, her bare, trembling fingers gently touching the side of his exposed throat. The first snow of the next winter fell on a land transformed. It was a soft, quiet fall, blanketing the plains and the northern canyons in a pristine layer of white. It muffled the sounds of the world, creating a hushed peace that felt both ancient and brand new. In the great hall of Stonehold, the twin thrones of ironwood and wolf pelt stood side by side before the roaring hearth. One was dark and familiar, carved with the snarling visage of a male wolf. The other was new, forged of the same dark wood but sleeker, more elegant, its arms carved in the shape of a she-wolf, her head raised as if to the moon. Raina stood on the high balcony, the one where Derek had felt the full force of her pain. She wore a simple gown of deep forest green, the color of new life, with no crown on her head. The cold air felt clean in her lungs, a welcome sting against her cheeks. She was not the queen of the Ashfall anymore, nor the broken Omega of her past. She was simply Raina, Luna of the Halvan Pack. The sound of boots on stone made her turn. Derek came to stand beside her, a heavy cloak of gray fur draped over his shoulders. He didn't speak, just rested his hand on the cold stone of the railing next to hers, a simple, solid presence. The bond between them was a warm, steady river, no longer a source of torment, but of quiet strength. It flowed with a deep, resonant hum of healed scars and accepted truths. The rite of reclamation had not been a magical cure. His surrender on the plains had been the first step, a shattering of pride that had allowed the bond to begin its slow, arduous process of mending. Her acceptance, her touch on his throat that was not a strike but a caress, had been the second. The weeks that followed had been the hardest of their lives. Integrating the Ashfall clan with the Halvan Pack was a brutal, delicate negotiation of culture and pride. The Ashfall were hard, silent survivors who saw the Halvan as soft and decadent. The Halvan saw the Ashfall as feral, uncivilized intruders. There were fights, challenges, and deep-seated mistrust. Kaelin had nearly challenged Derek for his alphaship, his mind unable to comprehend his king's act of submission. It was Raina who had faced him down, not with a threat, but with the cold, hard logic of a queen who knew war. She laid out the truth of their position. The weakening borders, the dwindling food stores, the rival packs circling like vultures. She showed them that Derek's surrender was not an act of weakness, but a strategic sacrifice that had saved them all from a devastating civil war they could not afford. Slowly, painstakingly, they had forged a new pack from the ashes of the old. The Ashfall's savage hunting skills and ruthless efficiency were tempered by the Halvan's established laws and community structure. The two halves, once poised to destroy each other, were making the whole stronger than it had ever been. Derek looked at her, his eyes the color of warm whiskey in the winter light. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice low. "The crown, the absolute power." Raina considered the question. She thought of the cold iron, the weight of a vengeance that had been her only companion for so long. "I miss the clarity," she admitted, her voice soft but clear, no longer the whisper of her youth nor the blade of her anger. It was her own. Vengeance is a simple path. This, building something new, is harder. She turned to look at him, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. But the crown was cold, and I was alone. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The simple touch sent a jolt of warmth through her, a comfortable fire that had become as familiar as breathing. Their healing had not been just political. It had been deeply personal, a rediscovery of each other in the quiet moments between council meetings and border disputes. They learned to talk, to share the fears and burdens they had both carried alone. He learned of the horrors she had endured in the blighted lands, and she learned of the crushing weight of the crown he had inherited. They found in each other not a rival, not a trophy, but a partner. The love between them wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't the sweet, innocent hope of the girl in the white dress, nor the fiery, possessive passion of a traditional alpha pairing. It was something quieter, deeper, forged in fire and shame and forgiveness. It was a love built on the foundations of their broken pieces, a mosaic more intricate and far stronger than anything they could have had before. "You are never alone again," he promised, his thumb stroking her cheek. A shout from the courtyard below drew their attention. A group of pups, a mix of ashfall and halvan blood, were engaged in a wild, tumbling snowball fight. Boran, the stoic, terrifying warrior, was in the center of it, a gentle giant allowing the smaller children to swarm him, his rare laughter a booming echo in the crisp air. It was a scene of such simple, profound peace that it brought a lump to Reyna's throat. This was what they had built. Not a kingdom of ash and fear, but a home, a future. "The scouts from the east returned," Derek said, his tone shifting back to that of the Alpha. "The Frostfang packs are pushing south again. They say a new warlord has united the clans." Reyna turned from the scene below and met his gaze, her eyes clear and resolute. A new threat on the horizon, a new challenge. But this time, they would not face it alone. "Then we will meet them," she said, and the word "we" was the most natural thing in the world. He smiled, a true, easy smile that reached his eyes. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of winter air and the promise of a shared dawn. It was a kiss that held no doubt, no fear, only the steady, unshakable certainty of two wolves, two souls who had walked through the fire and found their way home. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the kingdom in white. It was not an ending, but a new beginning, written on a clean, fresh page. The story of the rejected bride was over. The story of the Halvan Queen and her king had just begun.